Shall begin. Thanks, Jim, for the introduction and for the opportunity to do this again this year. 6 years in a row. I don't think I'd counted all of them, but I'm glad to be doing it. It's kind of one of my favorite things to do each year, and it's become a bit of a tradition. So I'm glad to do it. I'll say just at the start that we're going to put Ryan's going to put the PDFs of these slides in the chat for you, which I recommend that you open up because some of the slides have some very small text on it. It's the only way to get all these country names onto one slide, and it'll be easier to see if you open it up on your own machine. And of course, then you'll have a copy of the slides if there's anything in there you want to refer to later. So with that, I'll get started. This is a presentation about what, for lack of a better word, I've been calling watch lists or human rights watch lists, although some of the lists that I'm going to talk about or indices are more about governance, and some are more about violence and mass atrocity. But one of the interesting things which we'll talk about is despite the difference in the putative subjects of each of these lists, the lists themselves actually have quite a bit in common. I've been a consumer of these lists for as long as I've been working as an academic. There's lots of valuable information produced in them every year. I've been a producer of at least 2 of these lists, one for the Political Instability Task Force and one for the Early Warning Project at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which you're free to check out, and I'll talk about a little bit today. But despite all the time I've spent with these lists, I've always been frustrated, and I know Jim shared this frustration, that sometimes they don't seem to talk to each other enough, and it's difficult for us to really compare the differences between some of these different lists, some of which seem to be focused on quite similar concepts and others different concepts. And one of the things that anybody who uses these lists will recognize right off the bat is that there's a lot of commonality, even when the thing that the list is looking at seems quite different. And Jim and I had noticed this. Jim also a consumer of these lists, and so Jim goaded me 6-7 years ago to see if we could systematically understand what it is that these lists have in common, what might be driving those commonalities. So this is just to say, we need to do some comparison between these lists, and we need to try to understand how it is that despite these lists being so different on their face, they nevertheless come up with some quite similar lists of the most at-risk countries. And so this year, I'm up to 21 watch lists. I think I started with 6 or 7, Jim. I keep adding. Occasionally, it will drop one. This is the first year, I should say, that the Holocaust Museum does not have its expert comparison list. I'm hoping we'll bring that back next year in an improved format. But for now, we've just got our statistical risk assessment. 21 different lists, 3 of them new to this group or to this analysis. The first 2, ACLID-CAST and the conflict forecast, are really short-term violence watch lists. So they predict either 6 months or a year out in the future how many violent events a country will experience. And then, of course, number 6 on the list is the one that Nate and Emily are going to talk about, and that's the State Resilience Index. So I expect that'll be on the list for many years to come, because the Fragile States Index has always been one of, I think, the best of all these lists. So we've got 21 of these different lists, and I encourage you to keep that page on the PDF open, because you'll want to refer to those abbreviations for each list. You'll see them on a bunch of the other slides, and it'll tell you what each list refers to. One other thing to note is that most of these lists you'll see came from 2022, a few from 2023. Those are the release dates of the list, but most of the lists are drawing on data that's at least a year old. And you'll see as we get into some of the results that means that things like countries like Ukraine actually are not ranked as highly as you might expect. And that's because, again, the data that's going into many of these lists is a year or more old. Again, you can just get a sense of the different kind of lists. The group at the top focused quite closely on violence, and the first three in particular on atrocities, most relevant to this group. And then as you go down the list, I've tried to order them roughly and kind of subjectively in a movement from the area focused on violence to more focus on human rights, and finally to kind of governance type issues near the bottom of the list. Another way to kind of think about how these lists relate to each other is to imagine them on these two axes. On the bottom axis ranges what's the list focused on, what's its substantive focus. Is it governance, like the rule of law index or the corruption perception index, all the way to the right, the highest forms of violence, like the People's Under Threat Index or the Early Warning Project that I'm involved with. And then on the vertical axis, some of these lists are really...
One minute. Can you try to make the slides full screen?
I don't think I can make it any bigger. This isn't doing anything, is it? Are they small for everybody? They are. Hold on. I will try to get out of sharing screen and try again. Is that any better? Or is it just the same? Oh, it is better. Okay. Great. Okay. Wonderful. Sometimes you just have to restart. So then on the vertical axis, you could see some of these indices are really focused on just telling us what's going on in the world right now. And some are really focused on attempting to forecast what conditions might be like in the future. And you'll see there's a kind of empty quadrant up here. I don't know if you could see my little laser, fake laser pointer, where we don't have many lists that are focused on forecasting what governance conditions might be like in the future. And the closest I think we really have is maybe the Positive Peace Index, which isn't explicitly a forecasting index, but does talk a little bit about its possible use as a way to anticipate changes in the future. Okay, so what happens when we put all of these 21 lists together and we rank all these lists, whatever order they were in when I got my hands on them? I changed their order so that number one on the list is the worst place to be. So one is bad on this list. You don't want to be number one. And number 162, you're only looking at the top 30 here, but the lists go to 162 different countries, all countries with overpopulation of 500,000. 162 is the best. So then what I did on this chart is just listed the top 30 on each list. And then in bold, I put all the countries that have an ongoing mass killing according to the Early Warning Project's list. And in green, I put each country that overlapped with the average list from 2023. So that's over here. This is your average rank across all 21 lists. So all of those are in green. And then you could see any other country that's in green overlaps with that. And so if you go to a list like the Fragile States Index here, you could see it has the most overlap with the average. Almost every country on that list is green, with the exception of Guinea-Bissau and Lebanon and Zimbabwe there. Whereas there are some other lists that are more black, and that means they don't overlap as much with the average list. And then here you can see the Global Fragility Act priority countries, which I've highlighted in orange, and there's quite a bit of that. And all I want you to take from this slide, if you want bigger versions of it, you can go to the last pages of the PDF. You'll see each one of these things as its own slide. What I really want you to take from it is that there's a lot of green and a lot of bold and a lot of orange on the slide. And that means these lists have a lot in common. They share a lot each with the average list. Almost all the mass killings that are going on in the world appear on these lists. And many of the global Fragility Act priority countries are on all the lists. And that just gives you a sense right off the bat that these lists have a lot of things in common in the very top of the list. Here's just another way to look at it, going all the way down to the top 50. Again, this is the average ranking across the 21 lists, with the same thing we've done before, bolding the countries with a mass killing and orange highlight for those countries on the Global Fragility Act priority list. After we've done something like this, another way to look at these data that I find interesting is we can take individual countries, and so I'll just walk you through the Global Fragility Act countries and show you how they differ across each of the 21 different lists. And we'll start here with Mozambique, which ranks 18th on the average list. So that's the highest of any of the GFA countries. And you can see generally that it ranks pretty high, meaning the numbers are low. On this one, higher bars are what you would like to have as a country, and lower bars are the ones that indicate you're at high risk. And the numbers are pretty low across almost all the lists for Mozambique. But you'll see as we move on between some different countries that that pattern can change. So here's Haiti. And you can see generally a pattern of very low numbers, with the exception, interestingly, of a couple of these atrocity-focused lists. The first three, which suggests that maybe Haiti is at risk of violence and poor government, but the risk of a large-scale atrocity seems to be a little bit lower, again, at least based on the data that we have from a year, probably from 2021, which is when most of these lists are drawing data. That could change next year. Here's Guinea, and here you begin to see a little bit different pattern, where over here the numbers are a little higher, meaning the risk of violence is a little bit lower, but over here the measurement of the governance pattern suggests that it looks pretty bad for governance. And then I'll just quickly scan through these other charts. Here's Libya again, looks pretty bad on everything, although some of the governance lists are better than you might have anticipated. Cote d'Ivoire, kind of in the middle on almost all of them. Here's Togo down at rank 39 on the average list. Again, kind of most of its numbers somewhere in the middle. Papua New Guinea. Benin, this is the first country out of the top 50 that we have, and Ghana. And then Jim asked me to highlight Uganda. You can see how it falls on these lists, and Zimbabwe that comes in at number 36 on the average. So that gives you a sense of what individual countries look like across each of the 21 lists. The next thing you might want to ask is, how did the average list change from 2022 to 2023? So last year's list to this year's list. We had 18 lists in common across these 2 years. The 3 new ones that have been added for this year are not included here, so the rankings are calculated slightly differently. And what you want to take away from this chart is yellow means relatively little change from last year to this year. Red means your rankings got worse, you became a higher risk, and green means you improved a little bit. And the main thing to take away from this is a lot of yellow, not a lot of movement in this average list between years. And that's maybe not surprising. Each individual list is going to show more change than the average of all of those lists together. But it does give you a sense of which countries are moving on many lists at the same time. And there you can see Burkina Faso with the biggest decline. It looks worse on most of those lists. And Libya with the best improvement. And I think that generally came from the the ceasefire and preparations for the elections that were supposed to happen in Libya. They haven't happened on schedule, and so it's quite plausible that if we look at this next year, Libya will have declined again and won't look like it's improved so much. So that's one thing we can do. Another way to look at those same data and get a sense of which countries are different from year to year is to just plot the two different lists with each country's rank, their 2023 rank on the vertical axis and their 2022 rank on the horizontal axis. When you plot it this way, you can see that countries that are above the 45-degree line, those are countries that improved into 2023. And those that are below the 45-degree line, they got worse. And so you could see a couple countries that improved on this list. Libya, Zimbabwe got a little bit better, Sierra Leone, and a couple countries that got worse. And I already mentioned Burkina Faso as the one that had the biggest downward movement of any of the high-ranking countries. Anyway, Russia, you can see if you go up more towards the middle of the list, Russia declined as well. So that's another way that we can compare these lists. But the list is pretty tight, and you can see up here that the correlation between the two lists is 0.99. That's a ridiculously strong correlation. Highest level of correlation you can have is 1. And so we're almost at the identical list. The ranks have changed very little. If you want to see a bigger change, you got to go longer apart in years. And so what I did here is just focusing on the 5 lists listed here that really focus more on conflict related measures, violence, instability, and compare those in 2018 to today in 2023. Again, 2023 on the vertical axis, 2018 down here on the horizontal axis. And same thing, if you're above the 45-degree line, you improved, and if you're below, that means you got worse. And so you could see the set of countries there that improved. And, shockingly, it looks like Ukraine improved since 2018. Again, that's almost entirely due to the fact that the data that goes into most of these lists is a little old, but also keep in mind, some of these lists are measuring things like Ukraine's governance and democratic performance. And in some ways, Ukraine actually has improved on those factors, even while other things obviously are going terribly wrong in the country. So there's a little bit of both of those things, I think, happening. So that's another way to compare the lists. I'll just show you, since it's the list that I work on, here's a comparison from 2018 and 2023 for the Holocaust Museum's Early Warning Project, statistical risk index, and a sense of which countries got worse here since 2018. Better since 2018. These are above the 45-degree line. So South Sudan has improved, DRC has improved, and maybe not surprisingly, Ethiopia has gotten worse on that list. Another way to compare these lists is to ask how strongly correlated each list is with each other list among the 21 lists. And so the easiest way to do that is to put them here on a grid with the name of each list mentioned twice, once here in the vertical column and once here along this horizontal row. And what that means is each list is correlated perfectly with itself. So you'll see this diagonal green line. Dark green means high level of correlation. They're all correlated exactly with themselves. And then lists that are less well correlated with each other show up in red. And the thing we see almost every year here is that this list, the Global Terrorism Index, is the least well correlated. And that's simply because this index includes the risk that your country will be the target of terrorist attacks. And for that reason, some very high development, relatively politically stable countries, to say relatively now when I mentioned the United States and the United Kingdom, but the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Belgium are all in the top 30 or 40 on the Global Terrorism Index, but on almost no other indices do those countries rank high. And so you see those countries are very poorly correlated with each other, whereas the World Inequality Index and the Human Development Index are almost identical at 0.97. Generally, we think of anything with a correlation above 0.7 as being a very strong correlation, and anything above 0.9 as meaning these lists are basically the same. There's a little noise in the lists. And so lots of strong correlation there. And the average correlation across these lists, excluding correlation with the average and excluding correlation with each other, is almost 0.7. So you can see the lists are measuring some very similar concepts. If, however, we look just at the correlation among the top 30, we see a somewhat different picture. The numbers here are a lot lower. The average correlation is only 0.2. And some of the correlations are actually negative, meaning ranking higher in the top 30 on one list makes you more likely to rank low in the top 30 on another list. And I think what this just reflects is that all the lists are pretty good at telling you that Chad is at higher risk than Sweden for almost any of the things that we care about. And so Chad's going to be in the top 30 and Sweden is not. But within the top 30, there's a lot of disagreement. Part of that is that each list is measuring something different. And part of that is that it's really hard, I think, to determine the difference between, say, Chad and Mali versus Chad and Sweden. And so we see a lot less agreement into the ranking of the top 30, as opposed to the question of, are you in the top 30 or not, which is, I think, you saw from that earlier chart. There's a lot of agreement on who's in and less agreement on exactly where in the top 30 they rank. And so that is what that tends to show you. Oh, so the last thing I want to do, and then I'll turn it over. What's driving the similarities between these lists? What is it that makes all these different lists on so many different things, from environmental protection to women's equality to the economic performance of a country and its amount of corruption and its risk of genocide? What makes all those diverse lists so strongly correlated with each other? And so to see if I could get a sense of this, I started with 9 variables that I just took from the broad literature on instability and violence. And those 9 variables, you can see them over here, are how wealthy the country is, your GDP per capita, how democratic you are, measured by the organization called VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Project, your rate of infant mortality, your population. Larger countries have more opportunities for violence and instability, the number of conflict deaths that are occurring in the previous year in your country, the number of coup attempts that your country has had in the last 30 years as a kind of measure of your underlying instability and likelihood that non-institutionalized leadership changes happen, whether you've ever had a mass killing in your history, how ethnically divided you are, and whether your country is ruled by a minority ethnic elite. And then to make it easier to understand how these variables relate to each other, I just took each of these variables and I rescaled them to give them all a mean score of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And then I took the rank on the average list, and instead of having it range from 0 to 162, I shifted that. And so they all range from 0 to 1. And what this means is that using the standard statistical model that I used to create the chart you're looking at now, we can now interpret these numbers as the effect of a 1 standard deviation change for each variable on your average list ranking when that risk ranking ranges from 0 to 1. And so when you see this democracy coefficient here at -9, well, that just means that controlling for everything else, if you increase a country's democracy level by 1 standard deviation, which is about 0.25 on a scale of 0 to 1, so about a quarter of the scale of democracy, you decrease its average rank score by about 10%. So move up a quarter of the way on the democracy scale, move down about 10% on the rank. variables that are over here to the right, those are variables that increase your risk: higher infant mortality, higher population, higher conflict deaths. Those all make you at greater risk. And then notice down at the bottom, I say this every year, but some of the variables that we think are important for things like this, we see are actually not even statistically significant. They're not different than 0. That's why these little error bars here overlap. And even if they were, their effect is pretty small compared to the other variables. So they don't have much effect at all on your overall ranking. What does this mean? Just as I wrap up, I think it tells us what probably most of us here already suspected, and that is that problems like underdevelopment and bad government and human rights abuses and atrocities and civil wars, those tend to go together. And that's probably because they emerge from, or they're at least enabled by, the same set of underlying conditions. And those are the things that these lists are picking up on. And if that's right, it probably also means that we should try to do more coordination in our efforts to combat these different types of problems, everything from environmental problems to gender equality, to economic development and conflict prevention, because it looks like our efforts to improve in one area are likely to help improve in other areas as well. So I expect I'm preaching mainly to the choir on that point here, but still, I hope at a minimum, what I've done here is give you some ammunition, maybe when you're trying to convince someone else that these kinds of efforts have more in common than they might think, to really try to prove that in an argument. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ben. We're going to pass over to Emily now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Ben. As always, such an interesting way of visualizing a truly chaotic amount of data. So it's always really helpful to watch how you organize all of that information. And I'm really excited to see how the State Resilience Index continues to show up in your data, because I think it is an interesting and different type of analysis. So I want to pass it over to my colleague, Nate Haken, who will be able to share much more in depth about not only the State Resilience Index, but also the new crisis shock simulator that we have been working on, and kind of how our 2 different indices feed into that new tool. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nate.
Nate, I think you're muted.
I frantically found the unmute button. Thank you. Sorry about that. No, thank you so much, Emily. And thank you, Ben. Looking at how these indices talk to each other is really helpful. And that's something that we've been working on a lot too. You know, each index only tells you what it tells you. It doesn't tell you what it doesn't tell you. And sometimes layering and juxtaposing these indices on each other can really add a lot of depth. And that's the reason we added this new State Resilience Index, actually, because we've been doing the Fragile States Index for 18 years. And, you know, we feel that it has been useful to point out and highlight and underline the things that are going wrong in different countries around the world. It is a list or a tool that helps us to identify patterns and trends in shocks and pressures. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you how a country might perform if faced with a shock in the future, at all. That's something that we've been surprised by year after year, and especially in the last few years. The question has always come up: is it a forecasting tool or not? And we're like, well, it can be used to, if you extrapolate, if you start to identify, cycles and patterns and the historical data, you can maybe try to forecast based on the tool and the trends. But we've continued to be frustrated by the ability of the Fragile States Index to tell us how a country will perform if faced with a shock. The other thing that it doesn't do is tell you what to do in order to prepare for a shock. It basically just tells you, here are the social, economic, political, and security pressures that exist. It doesn't really help you highlight or surface areas of opportunity that may exist even in a fragile state. So for that reason, over the last few years, we started this Fragile States Index, the State Resilience Index. And we really don't intend to use the State Resilience Index in isolation either, because the State Resilience Index, also only tells you what it tells you and doesn't tell you what it doesn't tell you. So what we're hoping to do is to kind of build a suite of tools that used together can really help us to answer some of these perplexing questions and take into consideration a lot of this complexity that has bedeviled us and caused us to have so many miscalculations, particularly over the last few years, whether we're talking about having put over $2 trillion into Afghanistan to build their resilience over 20 years. And nevertheless, it ended up being as fragile or prone to instability or lacking resilience at the end of that whole adventure than it was perhaps at the beginning. So that was a miscalculation. Another miscalculation on the positive side is no one expected Ukraine to be able to be as resilient as it was. And surely, as we'll see in this year's lists when they come out, Ukraine will certainly crash on all these indices. But nevertheless, it was shocking to all of us that Ukraine wasn't immediately overrun when it was attacked, and so it has shown resilience well beyond what we could have imagined to be the case. And then another miscalculation is countries even like the United States, which were expected to be the most resilient, the most well-prepared to face a pandemic, if it were to strike. And it wasn't, as it turned out. And in fact, not only was it not prepared to deal with the pandemic, it was prepared perhaps when you talk about health systems, but because of the complexities and the cascading and compounding effects of a pandemic across social, political, governance, dimensions, it was way more destructive than anyone would have imagined, especially when compared to other countries around the world, for instance. So for that reason, we built this new tool. It's a State Resilience Index, and the idea, and we also built, as Emily highlighted, a crisis sensitivity simulator. And these three tools together, we hope will be useful for scenario development and even wargaming and decision supports around, first identifying what is a perfect storm scenario for a particular country, whether it's the United States or Bolivia or Brazil or Somalia. What would be the perfect storm scenario given the last 18 years of data on the Fragile States Index juxtaposed against the State Resilience Index. So once you identify what the perfect storm scenario is, then you can go back and you look at the Fragile States Index to see what is the history of these shocks and pressures in the country. And then after that, you can look at the State Resilience Index to try to surface areas resilience that you can hopefully build upon for better preparedness, and so that if that perfect storm scenario strikes, that you'll be better positioned. So I'm just going to go through these slides pretty quick, I think. This slide just shows you the Fragile States Index, to put the State Resilience Index in context. It's measuring pressures and shocks across, social, economic, political, and security drivers of instability. So whether it's state legitimacy pressures, or whether it's demographic pressures, or whether it's economic pressures, those are the things that we're measuring. It's truly a focus on pressures and shocks. It does not measure capacities and capabilities. So if you look at Uganda, for instance, if you go to our website, there's little dashboards you can use to look at the trends across 18 years of data. You can see that Uganda has gotten slightly improved since 2016, and then you can drill down to the individual indicators and look at the trends across those 12 indicators for Uganda, for instance. Whereas Cameroon has worsened since 2006, and it's been sort of a steady and inexorable worsening over the last 18 years. And again, if you wanted to kind of see which indicators are driving this trend, you can go to the website and you can drill down and see which factors are contributing to this overall trend. And this can be helpful because you might see some leading indicators, you might see some lagging indicators, and that can help you do your analysis based on those trends. So quickly, the State Resilience Index is this new tool to try to fill these gaps that I mentioned in order to forestall miscalculations. And it's important to note that resilience is not the absence of fragility. It's not the absence of crisis. When you look at the Fragile States Index, any country in the world can experience a shock. So, whether you're resilient or not resilient, you're going to face a shock from time to time. So if you jump up in the FSI index, for instance, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not a resilient country. So that's one thing that we want to emphasize. Resilience is the extent to which a country can prepare, manage, and recover from a crisis relative to the severity of that crisis. And so if you are a resilient country, the crisis will be less severe, the crisis will be less likely to cascade and compound across social, economic, political, and security dimensions. I think that's important because an economic shock, for instance, is likely to remain an economic shock. It's not likely to remain a political or a security crisis as well, for instance. Recovery time will be faster, and the crisis will be less likely to be recurrent. If you look at many of these lists that Ben highlighted for us, you'll see that a lot of countries kind of remain clustered at the top of those lists year after year after year, and that's because they're experiencing recurrent and continuous shocks, and it can't get out of it. If a country is resilient, it will experience a shock, but then it will be able to potentially climb back down, and also it may not experience that shock over and over and over again, which is what we see in many fragile states. So to build this tool, we first ran a bunch of regressions. We were fortunate or unfortunate to have the opportunity to use the global pandemic as an opportunity for research. It's rare that you'll experience a single shock that hits the entire world in the same year. And so usually when you're trying to do this analysis, you're kind of mixing apples and oranges and trying to run all these comparisons that really it's hard to do. But with 2020, we were able to run a bunch of regressions against the Delta and protests, COVID deaths, economy, violence, and other things in order to kind of begin to discover what types of things should be included in this resilience index as potentially mitigating factors that can help countries to be better prepared to bounce back from crisis. And then we did some tabletop exercises with development, environment, and security experts. And then we did some field research in several countries in order to kind of see, what should be included in this index. It's still in a beta sort of state in the sense that every time you have the first year for every index is kind of a beta, because you begin to discover things that need to be kind of added or expanded in years 2 and onward. That certainly, when I first joined Fund for Peace 18 years ago, that first year we learned a lot, and the second years and onwards were better for the Fragile States Index. So these are the pillars that we use: civic space, economy, environment, inclusion, individual capability, social cohesion, state capacity. You can see the number of sub-pillars that we have for each of those, and the number of metrics that we include within each of those as well. Social cohesion, we think it's pretty good, but it's the thinnest of the 7, but it's also perhaps the most important one. So we want to work on that more, looking at year 2 and 3. So I'm not going to read all these, but you can see that the way we think about these 7 pillars, we look at them all through the lens of what does a country need in order to be well positioned to bounce back from a potential shock. So you look, for instance, at inclusion. When people are socially, economically, or politically included, they have less exposure to risk and vulnerability, are represented in decision making, and have access to public resources to mitigate and respond to crisis and disasters. And you can see that each of those is kind of operationalized through that lens of how can a country be better prepared or positioned to bounce back from a shock if it were to strike. They're all important, however. Some of them look like they might be similar. If you look at social cohesion, and then you see in the next slide, we've got civic space. You might, generally find that civic space and social cohesion, perhaps you might posit that they're correlated, and perhaps they are. However, you definitely need both, because if you only have one of them, it doesn't work. If you have very strong civic space, and you have platforms for, engagement and dialogue and argument and debate, but you don't have social cohesion, then those platforms, instead of becoming a healthy public square for consensus building, it turns into a gladiator's arena for people to shout each other down and to further polarize. And that's certainly a trend that we've seen in the United States over the last several years. And that you can see in the Fragile States Index, in the group grievance and factionalized elites indicators. And you can also see it in the resilience index as well, when you look at it through the lens of these dimensions. So very important to have all of these 7. You can't just have one or the other of them. And if you look at our website, there's dashboards. Uganda, for instance, you can see here, each of these lines shows you all the countries in the world that we look at, from low resilience to high resilience. The line is the median, and the circle is the country that's been highlighted. So you can see that Uganda is very far below the median in a few of these. It's above the median in environment ecology. So that may suggest opportunities for building upon the resilience factors that exist and shoring up the resilience factors that perhaps don't exist as much. If you look at Cameroon, it's very similar, but they all shift a little bit to the left, given the fact that Cameroon has been deteriorating over the last 15 years, and Uganda has actually been improving slightly over the last few years. And then if you look further on our website, you can drill down to the sub pillar level. This is Uganda, and you can see at the sub pillar level from low resilience to high resilience, and you can just zero in on where you need to focus in order to prioritize your interventions, perhaps to promote resilience in Uganda, so that it'll be better positioned to face shocks were they to strike. Cameroon, same thing. And you see that sometimes some of the environmental, at least in Uganda, some of the environmental sub-pillars are kind of more resilient. Some of the more governance ones might be less resilient, but at least this gives you a sense of what you can focus on in your work. Now, I'm really excited about the crisis sensitivity simulator, and I'll just give this very quickly, a very quick overview, but please go to the website, or I can give you a demo later, one-on-one or whatever, if you're interested. But the crisis sensitivity simulator, I'll show you this first. This generates a bunch of box plots, and you can select a country and you can select the degree of shock to the country. So you can say, I want to pick Uganda, and I want to shock it. I want to shock each of these indicators, each of these fragile states index indicators with a high shock. You can do a medium shock or a low shock, but I'm going to do a high shock, and I'm going to see how it's going to affect the overall score, the overall stability of the country, as measured by the difference between the fragile states index and the state resilience index. And so you can see that factionalized elites, that Uganda is very sensitive to factionalized elites shocks. If there is a shock to factionalized elites, whether it's a leadership transition, adverse transition issue, or a political controversy or something like that, it's going to be especially dangerous for Uganda. And you can see across the 4 categories: cohesion, economy, political, and social indicators, which ones are most sensitive in Uganda to a potential shock. And you can there derive what would be a perfect storm in Uganda, and you can prepare against it. You can do your wargaming around this, and then lead to a whole lot of more in-depth qualitative discussions with experts in the field. So the methodology for that is it takes the 18 years of fragile states index data, creates a table for the parameters of every one of those indicators, and then pulls 1,500 random draws from that in order to generate sort of a baseline distribution. And the baseline distribution tells you the different quartiles. So, it could fall anywhere between this range, but the most likely, range would be the median, but, then you have the 2 tails. But it gives you a sense of what you're dealing with in terms of baseline. And then what it does is, when you shock it, you can shock each of those indicators, and then it'll show you, based on the 18-year history, how sensitive the country is to being, the overall score being worsened, based on those shocks. And so that's sort of the methodology. There is a white paper on our website you can read to get more detail on that, but just to give you an idea of how that works. However, what we would like to do is we would like to use this in our own work to really do much more in-depth scenario planning, in order to identify opportunities for resilience promotion in countries around the world, and we hope that you also find it useful. I will stop there, but the website for the simulator is up here, and you can reach out with any questions. We're really excited about this tool. We're going to be doing a lot more work on it over the next year in our partnership with SAS, but we think it's a pretty exciting resource that we're looking forward to using, and we hope that you find it useful as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate. I kind of want to put a question to both of you, to both Ben and Nate, and that is, what happens with all of this in the next generation? And by the next generation, I mean, what happens if we are able to start employing things like GPT-4, 5, or whatever? How does that affect both of the work that both of you are doing? And moreover, what does it mean for the potential of amalgamating all of these different tools?
Could take a first stab at that, and maybe I can even see if I can share my screen again and show you an example of some of the things I've been thinking about. I can get this back up. This will be useful, I think. To the right page. Okay. You guys see that? So as we talked about, both Nate and I, that, you know, one of the issues with these lists is that they just by necessity have to draw on data that's pretty stale. That's just because that's how long it takes to generate data on everything from GDP to infant mortality. When those things change, there are people on the ground who are measuring them in various ways. It takes a while for them to measure them, report them, and for them to make their way into these different lists. And so usually these lists are working with data that's at least a year old and sometimes longer. And that can be true even when it's just obvious to everybody that things are changing in each country. And that's just been too expensive for most organizations to get around in the past. We can't be tracking all of the inputs to our lists ourselves on a, you know, day-to-day or week-to-week basis. But one of the amazing things that these large language models like GPT-4 can do is that they have a really robust ability to understand and summarize text for us. And therefore, if it's the case that some of the things that matter to us are being reported in text, whether that be in a news story like the one you're looking at now, or in social media, we should be able to draw data from that vast amount of text that's being generated all the time on a daily basis and turn that text into data that can feed into our models. And so I just gave an example here of using, this is GPT-3. GPT-4 is even better, although GPT-3 got this one just about perfect, where I gave it a snapshot from an AP article about a protest in Jordan. And you can imagine here running this on every AP article that comes out. If I want to know whether there was a protest and I want data about that protest, how many people were in it, did it turn violent, what was the subject of the protest, what city did the protest happen in, I used to have to try to hire an undergrad to read all of these lists. And now GPT-3 can do it literally in a fraction of a second. I think that's the obvious place where this changes, and the technology is now, I think, for the first time actually here. And what we need to work on is just ways to allow us to interact with it so that whatever we might be interested in measuring, whether that's protests or low-level violence or political infighting among elites, can be coded systematically without the user needing to be a programmer, him or herself. So I think that's really the big change, and that ought to allow us to overcome the biggest weaknesses of all these lists, which is that they tend to be lagging what's happening in the real world.
I was so excited when Ben showed this the other day because this is a enormous opportunity. I think we at the Fund for Peace, for the Fragile States Index, we use content analysis to try and get some more sort of real-time trends. And what we do for that is we have about 8,000 Boolean search strings that we developed, one for each country indicator, in order to be able to then scan. We scan about 50 million documents with those search strings, and then we calculate, you know, the ratio of hits against sort of the overall number of articles in order to then see divergence from baseline. So if you have a sharp increase in protests from year to year, that tells us something, and you can do that month to month or week to week or day to day. So there's great opportunity there. However, it's very, very noisy data, and so we've had to use it within those limitations of the noisiness, and kind of look more at the tails than just look at sort of the overall distribution, and treat it more. So this what Ben just described, I can imagine using the content analysis to sort of identify the thousands of articles that we want to then read with with ChatGPT-4, for instance, and it could just be so dynamic. It's just mind blowing the possibilities. And I'm really excited to talk to Ben and any of you who are interested to explore some of these potentials going forward as we think about how to build upon the tools that we have. We are working with SAS right now, and they do have they're talking about doing artificial intelligence enhancements to the crisis sensitivity simulator. I don't know what that means, frankly. But it's a whole new world now. I mean, even in the last few months, just thinking about the possibilities, it's hard to get your head around it.
Well, in line with that, when you look across all of the different disciplines, we have a variety of different tools that we sort of apply in isolation from one another to isolated databases. What do you think about the capability of using something like this, not only to integrate the databases, but to integrate a variety of different tools so that you are then able to come at these problems from several different directions and to do it relatively quickly, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, what I just showed you as an example is just its ability to summarize and extract data from text. But the next version of these models, in fact, people are already working on these, and some are already available to play around with, connect these models to data that exists on the internet or anywhere else, and allows the model to go out and grab for you the relevant information from those resources, starting with as simple a thing as Wikipedia, but eventually going into scientific abstracts and databases of scientific papers, all the databases that are available publicly along with their documentation on a bunch of different web pages that archive data. And you can imagine, again, this I don't think is 20 years in the future. This is 3-5 years in the future, these models being able to grab and integrate data from hundreds of different sources and allow that data to speak to it to each other in a way that would have taken weeks and weeks of human effort to put together. That's a completely different world. When it takes that long, generally we don't do it. So we don't know those data exist. It's not new data. All this information is already there. It's just been too costly for us to process.